Margaret stood at the kitchen window, watching her husband Thomas load supplies into the wagon. After 5 years of marriage, she still felt the weight of whispered words following her through town. Barren, they called her behind cupped hands. Poor Thomas, married to a woman who can't give him children. The morning sun cast long shadows across their small homestead outside Cedar Falls. Thomas had built this house with his own hands, dreaming of filling it with the laughter of children. Instead, it remained quiet except for their conversations and the occasional visit from neighbors. It always seemed to look at Margaret with pity. "Ready, Maggie?" Thomas called, his voice gentle as always. He never blamed her, never spoke harsh words about their childless state. But she saw the sadness in his eyes when he watched other men playing with their sons or teaching them to ride. Margaret smoothed her worn brown dress and picked up her small traveling bag. The widow Harrison had sent word 3 days ago, desperate for help. Her sister had fallen gravely ill in the next county, and she needed someone to care for her household while she traveled to tend to family matters. The job would last 2 months, maybe 3. "Mrs. Harrison is paying well," Margaret said as she climbed onto the wagon seat beside Thomas. $20 for the full-time, plus room and board. Thomas nodded, clicking his tongue to urge the horses forward. "It's good work, and the widow Harrison is known to be fair, but I'll miss having you home." The journey to the Harrison ranch took most of the morning. Margaret had only met the widow a few times in town, but everyone spoke well of her. She had lost her husband to fever to winters past, leaving her to manage a substantial ranch with the help of hired hands. No children had blessed their marriage either, though whispers suggested it was her husband who had been unable to father young ones. The Harrison Ranch sprawled across a valley between rolling hills, with a large main house, several outbuildings, and corrals holding fine horses. As their wagon approached, Margaret noticed a small figure playing near the barn. A child, perhaps 4 or 5 years old, with dark hair catching the sunlight. "Whose child is that?" she asked Thomas, surprised. Before he could answer, widow Harrison emerged from the house. She was a tall woman in her 40s, with prematurely gray hair and intelligent brown eyes. Behind her walked a man Margaret didn't recognize, leading the dark-haired child by the hand. "Mrs. Patterson, thank you for coming," the widow said warmly as Margaret climbed down from the wagon. "This is Jacob Winters. He's been working my ranch since spring, and this little one is his son, Daniel." Margaret's breath caught as she looked at the child. Daniel had the brightest green eyes she had ever seen, and when he smiled shyly at her, something stirred deep in her heart. She had been around children before, had held neighbors' babies and played with their toddlers. But something about this boy felt different. Jacob Winters removed his hat, revealing thick brown hair and tired eyes. He was younger than Thomas, perhaps 30, with calloused hands and the lean build of a man who worked hard for his living. "Ma'am," he said quietly. "Daniel, say hello to Mrs. Patterson." "Hello," the boy whispered, pressing closer to his father's leg. "His mother passed last winter," widow Harrison explained softly. "Jacob came here looking for work and a fresh start for them both. He's been a blessing to this ranch." Margaret felt her heart clench with sympathy. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mr. Winters." Jacob nodded briefly. "Thank you, ma'am." Daniel's been the man of few words since then, but he's a good boy. Thomas helped unload Margaret's belongings while widow Harrison showed her around the house. Main house was larger than their homestead, with 4 bedrooms upstairs and spacious common areas below. Margaret would have her own room and take care of cooking, cleaning, and general household management. "Jacob and Daniel live in the foreman's cottage behind the barn," the widow explained. "Jacob takes his meals here most days, and Daniel often joins him. I hope you don't mind having a child around. He's very well behaved." "Mind?" Margaret's heart sang at the thought. "Not at all. I enjoyed children's company." After Thomas left for home with promises to visit when he could, Margaret began settling into her temporary life. She prepared dinner for the household, and when Jacob arrived with Daniel, she watched the boy carefully. He ate quietly, answering questions with nods or single words, his green eyes darting around the room as if always watching for danger. That first evening, as she cleaned up after supper, Margaret heard soft crying from the porch. she found Daniel, sitting on the steps, tears streaming down his cheeks as he clutched a small wooden horse. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" she asked gently, sitting beside him. "I miss Mama," he whispered. "Papa says she's in heaven, but I want her here." Margaret's throat tightened. Without thinking, she pulled the little boy into her arms. He came willingly, burying his face against her shoulder as sobs shook his small body.
Oh.
She held him close, stroking his dark hair and making soothing sounds. "It's all right to miss her," she said softly. "Your mama loved you very much, and that love stays with you always, even when she can't be here." Jacob appeared in the doorway, his face creased with worry. When he saw his son in Margaret's arms, something flickered across his features. Relief, perhaps, or surprise. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "He's been having bad nights lately." "No need to apologize," Margaret replied, still holding Daniel. "Sometimes we all need someone to hold us when we're sad." Jacob's eyes met hers over his son's head, and Margaret felt an unexpected flutter in her chest. There was something in his gaze, a loneliness that matched her own. But she pushed the feeling aside. She was a married woman, here to do a job. Nothing more. As she carried the sleepy boy to his father, Margaret couldn't know that this moment would change everything. That caring for this motherless child would awaken something in her heart that had been sleeping. That the next 2 months would challenge everything she thought she knew about love, family, and her own deepest desires. The days at the Harrison Ranch fell into a pleasant rhythm. Margaret rose before dawn to prepare breakfast, finding comfort in the familiar routine of cooking and cleaning. But the highlight of each day came when Daniel would appear at the kitchen door, his green eyes still heavy with sleep, clutching his wooden horse. "Good morning, Mrs. Patterson," he would say politely, just as his father had taught him. "Good morning, Daniel. Are you hungry for pancakes today?" she would reply, and slowly his shy smile would emerge. Jacob usually appeared shortly after, hat in hand, thanking her quietly for breakfast before heading out to work the ranch. Margaret found herself looking forward to these brief exchanges, though she couldn't quite understand why. There was something about the widower that drew her attention. Perhaps the gentleness she observed when he spoke to his son, or the way he always asked if she needed anything before he left for the day too. Weeks into her stay, Margaret discovered that Daniel had been sleeping poorly. She heard him crying again one night and found Jacob walking the porch with the boy, both of them looking exhausted. "He has nightmares," Jacob explained quietly, "about the night his mother died. Nothing I do seems to help." Margaret's heart ached. "For them both, may I try something?" "Oh." Jacob hesitated, then nodded. Margaret took Daniel's hand and led him to the kitchen, where she warmed milk and added honey. As the boy sipped the sweet drink, she told him stories about brave knights and gentle dragons, tales her own mother had shared when she was small. Daniel's eyelids grew heavy, and when the milk was finished, he looked up at her with trusting eyes. "Will you tell me another story tomorrow?" "Of course," Margaret promised, tucking him into Jacob's arms. The next evening, Daniel appeared at her door again, and the next. Soon story time became their nightly tradition. Margaret would sit in the rocking chair by the fireplace, Daniel curled in her lap, as she spun tales of adventure and magic. Jacob would listen from the doorway, never interrupting, but his presence felt like a warm weight in the room.
"Here."
"Good with him," Jacob said one evening after Daniel had fallen asleep. "He hasn't been this settled since before his mother passed." Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. "He's a wonderful child. You should be proud." "I am, but raising him alone. ... Jacob's voice trailed off as he lifted his sleeping son. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm enough." The vulnerability in his admission made Margaret's chest tighten. "You're a good father, Jacob. Anyone can see how much you love him." Their eyes met across the room, and Margaret felt that strange flutter again. She looked away quickly, reminding herself of her place. She was married. She was here temporarily. These feelings, whatever they were, had no future. But as the weeks passed, it became harder to ignore the way her heart jumped when Jacob smiled, or how right it felt when Daniel called her Miss Maggie with increasing affection. The boy had started following her around the house, helping with small tasks, chattering about everything that caught his interest. For the first time in her life, Margaret felt like a mother. One afternoon, while hanging laundry, she heard Daniel crying in the barn. She found him sitting in an empty stall, tears streaming down his face. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" "The other boys in town say I don't have a mama anymore," he sobbed. "They say their mamas make them cookies and fix their clothes and hug them when they're scared. I don't have anybody to do those things." Margaret's heart shattered. Without hesitation, she knelt and pulled him into her arms. "Daniel, you have your papa, who loves you very much. And while I'm here, I can make cookies and fix your clothes if you'd like." "But you're not my mama," he whispered against her shoulder. The words cut deep, not because they hurt, but because of how much she suddenly wished they weren't true. "No," she said gently, "I'm not your mama. But I care about you very much, and that's something, isn't it?" Daniel nodded, sniffling. "Miss Maggie, do you think my mama would like you?" Margaret's throat tightened. "I hope so, sweetheart. I think she would want someone to take care of you and make you feel safe." That evening, Jacob found her in the garden, tending to the vegetables. "Daniel told me about what happened today." "Shh. What you said to him?" He paused, studying her face. "Thank you. You've given him something I couldn't." "What's that?" "Mothers. Comfort, even if it's temporary." The word temporary hung between them like a stone. Margaret forced herself to remember her husband, her real life waiting in town. But when Daniel ran up to show them a butterfly he'd caught and released, when he slipped his small hand into hers as naturally as breathing, she felt a completeness she'd never experienced. Later that night, alone in her room, Margaret faced the truth she'd been avoiding. She was falling in love with this small family. Not just with the idea of having a child, but with Daniel specifically, with his curious questions and soft giggles. And if she was honest with herself, she was developing feelings for Jacob too. The realization terrified her. She was a married woman. Thomas was a good husband who deserved better than a wife who dreamed of another man's embrace. But when she closed her eyes, she didn't see Thomas waiting for her at home. She saw Jacob's quiet smile and Daniel's bright eyes. A letter arrived from Widow Harrison the next week. Her sister's condition had worsened, and her absence would extend at least another month. Margaret read the news with mixed emotions. More time with Daniel, more evenings of stories and laughter. More opportunities to fall deeper into a love that could never be. That night, as she tucked Daniel into bed, he looked up at her with serious eyes. "Miss Maggie, when you go home, will you forget about me?" Margaret's heart clenched. "Never," she promised, kissing his forehead. "I could never forget you." But as she said the words, she wondered how she would survive leaving him behind. How she would return to her quiet house and empty arms, pretending that these weeks had meant nothing. How she would look at Thomas and not see Jacob's face instead. Outside, storm clouds gathered on the horizon. Margaret watched them through her window, thinking they matched the turmoil building in her heart. Soon, she would have to make impossible choices. But for now, she had Daniel's laughter echoing through the house and Jacob's grateful smiles to sustain her. The storm that Margaret had watched building finally arrived 3 days later, bringing with it winds that rattled the windows and rain that turned the ranch roads to mud. Jacob and the other ranch hands worked frantically to secure the animals and equipment, while Margaret kept Daniel entertained indoors with games and stories. "Papa's been gone a long time," Daniel said, pressing his nose to the window as lightning split the sky. "He's making sure all the horses are safe," Margaret assured him, though she felt the same worry gnawing at her stomach. The storm had been raging for hours, and she hadn't seen Jacob since morning, when the kitchen door finally burst open. Margaret's heart leaped with relief. But instead of Jacob, it was Tom Bradley, one of the ranch hands, supporting another man who was clearly injured. "Mrs. Patterson," Tom called breathlessly. "We need help. Jake's been hurt." Margaret's blood turned cold. She quickly settled Daniel in the parlor with his wooden toys and rushed to help. Jacob was conscious but pale, his left arm hanging at an odd angle, his shirt torn and bloody. "What happened?" she asked, helping them get him to the kitchen table. Tree branch came down in the wind, Tom explained. Caught him across the arm and shoulder. Think the arm might be broken. Margaret had assisted the town doctor enough times to recognize the signs. Jacob's arm was definitely broken, and he had several deep cuts that needed attention. Daniel can't see him like this, she said quietly. Tom, can you keep the boy occupied while I tend to Jacob? As Tom led Daniel away with promises of checking on the new foal in the barn once the storm passed, Margaret turned to Jacob. His green eyes, like his son's, were clouded with pain but alert. This is going to hurt, she warned, beginning to cut away his torn shirt to examine the wounds properly. I've had worse, he said through gritted teeth, then caught her wrist gently as she worked. Margaret, if something happens to me, will you make sure Daniel gets to my brother in Kansas? He's the only family we have left. The use of her first name sent a shock through her, but the request behind it made her chest tight with fear. Nothing's going to happen to you, Jacob Winters. I won't let it. She worked carefully, cleaning and bandaging his wounds, while he sat stoically silent. When she needed to set his broken arm, she gave him a leather belt to bite down on and worked. As quickly as she could, his muffled groan of pain made tears spring to her eyes, but she didn't stop until the arm was properly split. There, she said softly, wiping sweat from her brow. You need to rest now. No arguing. Jacob tried to stand and immediately swayed. Margaret caught him, his weight solid and warm against her. For a moment, they were very close, her hands on his chest, his good arm instinctively circling her waist to steady himself. The air between them crackled with something that had nothing to do with the lightning outside. Margaret, he whispered, and she could see in his eyes that he was fighting the same feelings she was. Don't, she said, stepping back quickly. Please, don't. But the damage was done. The careful distance they had maintained was crumbling, and they both knew it. Over the next few days, as Jacob recovered from his injuries, Margaret found herself caring for him as well as Daniel. She brought him meals, changed his bandages, and made sure he rested instead of trying to return to work too soon. The intimate nature of tending to his injuries forced a closeness that made her heart race. Daniel, unaware of the undercurrents between the adults, was delighted to have both his father and Miss Maggie nearby. He chattered constantly, played games that required minimal movement from Jacob, and insisted on helping Margaret with the nursing duties. Papa, does your arm hurt? He asked one afternoon, climbing carefully onto Jacob's lap. Not so much anymore, Jacob assured him, smoothing the boy's dark hair with his good hand. Miss Maggie took very good care of me. Over Daniel's head, Jacob's eyes met Margaret's, and the gratitude there was mixed with something deeper, something that made her breath catch. That evening, after Daniel had fallen asleep, Margaret sat with Jacob on the front porch. Storm had passed, leaving the air clean and cool. They didn't speak at first, just listened to the night sounds and watched fireflies dance in the darkness. I've been thinking, Jacob said finally. About what? You said to Daniel in the barn that day, about caring for him. Margaret's heart began to race. Jacob, please don't. Let me finish. His voice was quiet but determined. I've watched you with him these past weeks. I've seen how his face lights up when you walk into a room, how he seeks your comfort when he's scared or hurt. I've seen how you look at him too, like he's precious to you. Tears stung Margaret's eyes. He is precious to me. But that doesn't change anything. I'm married, Jacob. I have a life to return to. Do you love your husband? The question hung in the night, air like a challenge. Margaret wanted to say yes immediately, the way she should. Instead, she found herself thinking about Thomas, about their quiet conversations and comfortable routines, about the gentle way he treated her despite her failings as a wife. I care for him, she said finally. He's a good man. That's not what I asked. Margaret stood up abruptly, wrapping her shawl tighter around her shoulders. It's the only answer I can give. Jacob was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was soft and sad. My wife Sarah used to say that love wasn't something you chose, it was something that chose you. I didn't understand what she meant until now. Margaret's breath caught. Jacob, please stop. I'm not asking you to leave your husband, he said. I know you're an honorable woman. But I need you to know that these weeks with you have been the happiest Daniel and I have known since Sarah died. It's not just because you've cared for us, but because you've brought light back into our lives." A tear rolled down Margaret's cheek. "You're making this so much harder than it already is." "I know, and I'm sorry for that. But when you leave here, you'll be taking a piece of our hearts with you. I thought you should know that before you go." Days later, a letter arrived from Thomas. He would be coming to collect her the following week earlier than planned. Business in town was picking up, and he missed her company. Margaret read the letter with a sinking heart, then looked out the window to where Daniel was playing with a litter of barn kittens, his laughter floating. On the breeze, that night she barely slept. In a week she would return to her old life, to her quiet house and empty arms. She would resume her place as Thomas Patterson's barren wife, the object of pitying glances and whispered conversations. Daniel would eventually forget her, find other mother figures to comfort him. Jacob would heal from his injuries and perhaps, someday, find another woman to love. But as she lay in the darkness, Margaret knew with crushing certainty that she would never forget them. The sound of Daniel calling her name, the way Jacob's eyes crinkled when he smiled, the feeling of being needed and loved for exactly who she was, these memories would have to sustain her for the rest of her life. Margaret spent the next few days trying to prepare Daniel for her departure without breaking her own heart in the process. She helped him make a memory book with drawings of their favorite moments together, teaching him to write his name so he could sign it for her. Each page felt like a small goodbye. "Will you come visit me?" Daniel asked as they worked on the book together at the kitchen table. Margaret's throat tightened. Cedar Falls was only a half-day's ride away, but it might as well have been across the ocean. "I'll try, sweetheart," she said. Hating herself for the promise she knew she couldn't keep, Jacob watched these preparations with growing tension. His arm was healing well, though it remained in a sling, and Margaret could see the conflict in his eyes every time she mentioned her upcoming departure. The careful distance they had tried to maintain was becoming impossible to sustain. The breaking point came on Thursday evening. Margaret was packing her few belongings when she heard Daniel crying in his room. She found him curled on his bed, clutching his wooden horse and sobbing as if his heart were breaking. "I don't want you to leave," he wailed when she sat beside him. "You're like my mama now. Please don't go away like she did." Margaret gathered him into her arms, her own tears flowing freely now. "Oh, Daniel, I don't want to leave you either." "Then stay. Papa likes you too. I can tell. You could be a real family." The innocent words cut deeper than any knife. Margaret held him close, breathing in his little boy's scent, memorizing the weight of him in her arms. "Sometimes grown-ups have to do things they don't want to do," she whispered. "That doesn't mean I don't love you. I'll always love you, no matter where I am." Jacob appeared in the doorway, his face stricken as he took in the scene. Margaret met his eyes over Daniel's head, and she saw her own anguish reflected there. Without a word, he crossed to them and wrapped his good arm around them both. A moment they stayed like that, holding each other as if they could stop time through sheer will. "Daniel," Jacob said finally, his voice rough with emotion, "Miss Maggie has to go back to her husband. It's where she belongs." "But she belongs here too," Daniel protested. "With us." Margaret's heart shattered completely. She kissed Daniel's forehead and gently transferred him to his father's arms. "I need to finish packing," she said, and fled the room before she could change her mind about everything. That night, Margaret walked in the garden under the stars, trying to find strength for what lay ahead. She heard footsteps and turned to find Jacob approaching, his face pale in the moonlight. He cried himself to sleep, Jacob said quietly. "Keep asking when you're coming back. Jacob, please don't make this harder than it is." "I'm trying to." He stopped a few feet away from her, his good hand clenched at his side. "I'm trying to say goodbye properly." They stood in silence for a long moment, the night air filled with the sound of crickets and their own ragged breathing. "I need to tell you something," Jacob said finally. "That first night, when you held Daniel while he cried about his mother, I knew you were different from other women. Not just because you were kind to him, but because of the way you looked at him, like he mattered to you already." Margaret wrapped her arms around herself, trying to hold her breaking heart together. "These past weeks," Jacob continued, watching. "You with him, Seeing how you've brought joy back into his life, I've been falling in love with you. Not just the idea of you, but you. Your laugh when Daniel says something funny. The way you hum while you cook. How you never make me feel like less of a man because I'm struggling to raise my son alone. Jacob, stop, Margaret whispered, but he continued. I know you have a husband. I know you have duties and obligations. I'm not asking you to abandon all of that for us. But I couldn't let you leave without telling you that if circumstances were different, I would spend every day trying to make you and Daniel happy? Margaret turned away, tears streaming down her face. You think I don't know that? You think I haven't imagined what it would be like to wake up here every morning to be Daniel's mother in truth, instead of just in my heart? You think I haven't wondered what it would feel like to be loved by a man who sees me as I really am instead of as a disappointment? Then stay, Jacob said simply. I can't. The words tore from her throat. I made vows, Jacob. I promised to honor my marriage. Thomas is a good man who doesn't deserve to be betrayed. And what about what you deserve? Margaret turned back to him, her face wet with tears. It doesn't matter what I deserve. It matters what's right. Jacob nodded slowly, though his eyes were bright with unshed tears. I know, that's one of the reasons I love you, Your Honor, even when it costs you everything. They stood there for another moment, memorizing each other's faces in the moonlight. Then Jacob reached into his pocket and pulled out something small. I want you to have this, he said, holding out a small wooden carving. It was a perfect miniature of Daniel's horse, carved with incredible detail. I made it during the long nights when my arm was healing. I wanted you to have something to remember us by. Margaret took the carving with trembling hands. It was warm from his touch and smooth as silk. It's beautiful. But Jacob, I could never forget you. Either of you, nor we you. He stepped closer, and for a moment Margaret thought he might kiss her. Instead, he raised his good hand to cup her cheek gently. If you ever need anything at all, you send word. Promise me. I promise, she whispered. The next morning brought Thomas in the wagon that would take her home. Had dressed carefully in her traveling clothes, packed away the simple cotton dresses she had worn at the ranch. She felt like she was putting on a costume, preparing to play the role of Mrs. Thomas Patterson again. Daniel clung to her skirts as Thomas loaded her bags, his face streaked with tears. Please don't go, Miss Maggie. Please stay with us. Margaret knelt and hugged him fiercely one last time. Be a good boy for your papa, she whispered. Remember all the stories I told you, and remember that I love you very much. I love you too, Daniel sobbed. Will you think about me every day? She promised and meant it. Jacob stood nearby, his hat in his hands, watching the goodbye with pain etched across his features. When Thomas called for her to come, Jacob stepped forward. Mrs. Patterson, he said formally, extending his good hand. Thank you for everything you've done for us. Margaret shook his hand, feeling the calluses on his palm, the strength in his fingers. For just a moment, he squeezed her hand gently, a secret goodbye that Thomas couldn't see. As the wagon pulled away from the Harrison ranch, Margaret looked back to see Jacob holding Daniel, both of them waving from the porch. She waved back until they disappeared from sight, then turned forward and tried to prepare herself for the life she was returning to. But the small wooden horse in her pocket seemed to pulse with warmth, and she knew that part of her heart would always remain at the ranch with the man and boy who had shown her what love could truly feel like. The first month home felt like living underwater. Margaret moved through daily routines, mechanically cooking Thomas's meals, tending their garden, maintaining their house, but her mind remained at the Harrison ranch. She wondered constantly about Daniel and Jacob, while Thomas attributed her distraction to adjustment. The wooden horse Jacob had carved lived in her pocket by day, under her pillow at night. Sometimes she held it while Thomas slept, tears sliding silently as she remembered Daniel's laughter and Jacob's quiet strength. 3 weeks after her return, Margaret was hanging laundry when Tom Bradley, the ranch hand, arrived with devastating news. Jacob had fallen from a horse 3 days earlier, hitting his head badly. He'd been unconscious since the accident. Daniel was beside himself, refusing to eat or sleep properly, constantly asking for her. Widow Harrison had returned from caring for her sister but couldn't console the frightened child. "Doc doesn't know if Jacob will recover," Tom said grimly. "It's the next few days will tell. But that little boy needs you desperately, Mrs. Patterson. I've never seen a child so heartbroken." Without hesitation, Margaret agreed to return. She quickly left Thomas a note explaining an emergency at the ranch required her help with a sick child, and rode harder than ever before toward the Harrison place. Daniel was hunched on the front porch steps when she arrived. Seeing her approach, he leaped up and ran, sobbing into her arms. "Miss Maggie, you came back. Papa won't wake up and I'm scared." Margaret held him tight, her own tears flowing. Widow Harrison appeared, showing relief and worry. "Thank God you've come. Daniel hasn't left the porch since the accident, just waiting." For his father, in Jacob's room, Margaret found him still and pale, a bandage around his head, his face slack in unconsciousness. Dr. Morrison explained the severity. Brain swelling needed to subside before they'd know about permanent damage. "Keep him cool. Talk to him," he advised. Familiar voices sometimes help pull people back. For 3 days, Margaret divided time. Between caring for Daniel and maintaining vigil beside Jacob, she barely slept, catching moments in the bedside chair. She told stories continuously, hoping Jacob could hear her somewhere in the darkness. Daniel curled in her lap as she spoke, whispering that Papa always smiled at the dragon afraid of my story. On the 4th morning, changing the cool cloth. On Jacob's forehead, Margaret watched his eyes flutter open. After a moment of confusion, his gaze found her face. "Margaret." His voice was barely audible. "Yes, I'm here." "You're going to be all right, Daniel. Sleeping. He's been so worried." She touched his cheek gently. "How do you feel?" "Like I was kicked by a horse." He tried sitting up, wincing. "Long for days? You scared us terribly." Weak hand found hers. "You came back?" "Of course I came back." Daniel burst in moments later, climbing carefully onto the bed. "Papa, you're awake. I knew Miss Maggie would make you better." Jacob's arm tightened around his son, eyes meeting Margaret's with gratitude, love, and something deeper hope. "I dreamed I heard your voice telling stories. It gave me something to follow back. Miss Maggie sang the lullaby Mama used to sing." Daniel added proudly. "The one about stars watching over little boys?" Margaret flushed. She'd sung Sarah's lullaby instinctively, wanting to give Jacob every comfort possible. "More than all right," Jacob said, voice thick with emotion. Dr. Morrison pronounced Jacob's recovery miraculous, requiring only quiet rest and no hard work for a month. Privately, he told Margaret that man and his son are alive because of you. "I've never seen such devoted nursing. What you've given goes beyond duty." That evening, Widow Harrison joined Margaret on the porch with tea. "Your husband sent word. He's concerned about your extended absence." Margaret's stomach clenched with guilt. "I should go home. Thomas deserves better than a wife who disappears without proper explanation." "Is that what you want?" Toward Jacob's window, then at Daniel chasing fireflies. "What I want doesn't matter. I have responsibilities. Sometimes our hearts know things our minds haven't figured out yet," the widow said gently. "I've watched you these months. I've seen how you look at that man and his boy, how they look at you. I've also seen how you hold yourself back from happiness. I'm married, but are you loved the way you deserve?" Later, checking on Jacob one final time, he caught her hand. "When I was unconscious, lost in darkness, your voice called me back. Not just the stories, but the love in your voice when you spoke to Daniel, to me. I followed that love back to the living world. Jacob, please don't. I must say this. I know you feel you have to leave. Return to your husband and old life. What we have is real, precious, worth fighting for. If you stay, I'll spend every day proving you made the right choice. And if I go, then I'll love you from afar and be grateful for our time together. But I'll never stop hoping that someday you'll come back to where you belong." Margaret knew she couldn't delay leaving any longer. Thomas would expect her home, and each day made departure more painful. While preparing breakfast, Daniel appeared, worried. "Miss Maggie, are you going away again? Your papa is better now." "Sweetheart, He doesn't need me anymore. But I need you, Daniel said simply. We're happier when you're here. Jacob appeared behind his son. Daniel, let Miss Maggie finish breakfast, he said, eyes fixed on Margaret's face. After breakfast, Jacob approached Margaret. You're leaving today, aren't you? Margaret nodded, not trusting her voice. Before you go, I need you to know something, Jacob said quietly. Yesterday, when I woke and saw your face, I knew I was home. You and Daniel are my home now. Jacob, please don't make this harder. I love you, he said. Simply, not just because you've cared for my son, but because of who you are. Your kindness, your strength, how you make Daniel laugh and feel safe again. Tears spilled down Margaret's cheeks. I love you too, both of you, more than I ever thought possible. Then stay, Jacob said. Marry me, Margaret. Be Daniel's mother. And my wife. I'm already married, Jacob. The law, the church, none of that will disappear because I want it to. Have you considered telling Thomas the truth about how you feel? Before Margaret could answer, rapid hoofbeats sounded in the yard. Thomas rode up, his face grim. He's here, she breathed, panic rising. Thomas dismounted and entered the kitchen. Seeing Margaret and Jacob standing close together, his expression grew troubled. Margaret, he said formally, I've come to take you home. Thomas! I can explain, can you? Because from where I'm standing, my wife has been playing house with another man and his child. Mr. Patterson, Jacob said calmly, your wife saved my life. Any man should be proud to have such a devoted, caring woman. Devoted to whom exactly? Because it seems my wife's devotions have been directed elsewhere lately. And what about what I need? Thomas demanded. I need a wife who comes home when promised. I need someone who chooses our life together instead of running away to care for other people's children, because she can't give me any. The words hit Margaret like a blow. Thomas, I never meant to hurt you. Margaret, I'm not blind. You've fallen in love with this man and his boy, haven't you? This was the moment of truth. She could lie and return home with Thomas, or tell the truth and face the consequences. Yes, she said quietly. Thomas stepped back as if struck. I never meant for it to happen, Margaret continued, tears streaming. But Jacob and Daniel needed me in a way no one ever has. I needed to feel like I mattered, like I was more than just a disappointment who couldn't give her husband children. You think I see you as a disappointment? Thomas asked. Don't you, Thomas? We've been married 5 years. I've never conceived. The whole town whispers about your barren wife. The whole town can go to hell, Thomas said. Margaret, I never married you for children. I married you because you were kind and intelligent. Children would have been wonderful, but they weren't the point. Margaret stared in shock. Then why didn't you ever say that? Because I thought you knew. I thought you understood you were enough, just as you are. The kitchen fell silent. Finally, Thomas looked at Jacob. Do you love her? Really love her? More than life itself, Jacob answered. I love her enough to let her go if that's best, and enough to fight for her if she'll have me. Thomas turned. To Margaret and you? Is this what you truly want? A life with him and his boy, even if it means scandal? Margaret thought about Daniel's bright smile, Jacob's gentle strength, how complete she felt, caring for them both. Then she thought about her empty house in town, spending her life wondering what might have been. Yes, she said firmly. This is what I want. Thomas sat heavily at the table. Well then, I suppose we need to talk about how to make this happen properly. Thomas, what are you saying?
I'm saying
I'd rather have you happy with someone else than miserable with me. I'll give you a divorce, Margaret, quietly. Condition, Thomas continued. I want to meet the boy. Daniel appeared in the doorway. He looked curiously at Thomas, then moved beside Jacob. Daniel, this is Mr. Patterson, Miss Maggie's husband. Daniel studied Thomas seriously. What? Are you going? To take Miss Maggie away again? That depends, son. Do you want her to stay? More than anything, Daniel said. She makes Papa smile, tells the best stories, and hugs me when I have bad dreams. I love her very much. What? Thomas nodded, expression softening. I can see why. He's a fine boy. You chose well. 6 months later, Margaret stood in the small county church in a simple blue dress. Holding wildflowers Daniel had picked that morning, the divorce had been finalized quietly. Thomas even attended the wedding, standing in back with a sad but genuine smile. When pronounced husband and wife, Daniel cheered loudly, making everyone laugh. Walking out as a newly formed family, Margaret saw several people from Cedar Falls who had come to witness the scandalous proceedings. Some looked disapproving, but Margaret didn't care. Let them whisper. She had Daniel's hand in hers, Jacob's arm around her waist, and a future full of love ahead. "Are you happy, Mrs. Winters?" Jacob asked as they reached their wagon. Margaret looked at her new husband, then down at Daniel. "Happier than I ever dreamed possible," she said. For the first time in her life, Margaret knew exactly where she belonged.